Russia has invaded Ukraine and factually started a war against Ukraine. The fact that Europe and Asia only express their deep concern and do not place sanctions is not enough to stop Russia. And here are the facts. Russia hasn't even slowed down, but on the contrary, it has increased its military presence in Ukraine, in Crimea and Ukraine twice. For example, approximately a week ago, there were around 15,000 Russian soldiers in Crimea. But now, on the 7th of March, there are over 30,000 Russian soldiers in Crimea, and they are spread all over Crimea and blockade Ukrainian military forces, and population of Crimea is scared of them. So Russia hasn't slowed down, and Russia doesn't care about Europe and Asia deep concern. But on the contrary, Russia doubled its military forces there, and it's realistic that of course Russia will continue increasing the number of their soldiers in Crimea and will eventually steal Crimea from Ukraine and eastern soils from Ukraine. And it clearly means that Russia doesn't care about concern of European Union and Asia. Therefore, if Europe and Asia close their eyes on Ukraine and don't place serious sanctions on Russia, and therefore allow Russia to steal Crimea from Ukraine, and allow this war in Ukraine and bloodshed in Ukraine to happen, it won't be all. Russia won't stop here. After that, Russia will steal eastern soils of Ukraine after stealing Crimea. And after that, the whole independence of Ukraine will be in danger. However, it's also not all. Russia will see that all Europe and Asia are afraid to place serious sanctions on Russia, and therefore sovereignty of other European countries that are located close to Russia will also be in danger. And this is not an exaggeration or my fantasy, because you've already seen that Russia behaves like king of the world, and I'm personally seriously worried about aggression of Russia, because this is the country that can realistically start the third world war, and this is not the first time Russia behaves aggressively without any serious excuses. Just remember the war in Chechnya, in Georgia, in Czech Republic, in Transnistria, and so on. Therefore, Europe and Asia, if you allow Russia to act like this, it will act like this forever. So, now I want to switch to just some of the facts about Ukraine-Russia war. First, every day, Border Guard Service of Ukraine forbids about 500 Russians to cross border of Ukraine and come into Ukraine. Why? Because these Russians have weapon and military uniform, and it's clear that they want to cross Ukrainian borders with the only intention to become Russian soldiers in Ukraine and support Russian troops and fight against democracy in Ukraine. Next, it's Russian information war on a huge scale all over the world. Russia openly lies to all the world about many, many things and wants to make everyone believe that black is white and white is black. For example, Russia said that its excuse for invasion into Crimea is to protect Russian minorities living in Crimea, because these Russian minorities in Crimea suffer from extremist Ukrainians who torture them, threaten, forbid to speak Russian language, threaten to steal all their property, and so on and so forth. However, this is a huge lie, and it's far opposite from the truth. No one threatens Russian minorities living in Ukraine, and so on and so forth. It's a huge lie of Russia. Next, Russia has Russian military forces all over Crimea. But at the same time, Russia claims that these military forces are not Russian, and Russia denies troop presence in Crimea. But it's again a huge lie, lied to all the world, and there are facts to prove this. Next, Russia is guilty on organizing pro-Russian riots and meetings in Crimea and on the east of Ukraine. For example, here's just one fact to illustrate that. Ukraine has facts that prove that Russia brought over 2,000 people from Russia to organize pro-Russian riots in Ukraine. Yes, you've heard it right. Russia brought over 2,000 Russians into Ukraine from Russia so that they organized pro-Russian meetings and riots here in Ukraine to make all the world believe that it's not Russians who organize these meetings and riots, but it's Ukrainians in Ukraine organizing these meetings and riots. And this is just one tiny example of how Russia organizes pro-Russian riots in Ukraine. Of course, there are many more people, many more Russians who came from Russia and whose primary goal is to organize these pro-Russian meetings and riots in order to divide Ukraine and to steal Crimea and eastern soils from Ukraine. Next, Russia has turned off Ukrainian TV channels in Crimea and instead turned on only Russian channels in Crimea. And as you understand, these Russian channels spread false information and distorted facts about newly elected government of Ukraine and all the situation happening in Ukraine. And this information war helps Russia scare the local population and make them believe that all newly elected Ukrainian government is evil and extremist and is full of terrorists and is going to torture them, threaten and kill them even, and that in this newly elected Ukrainian government will forbid Russian language in Ukraine at all and punish those people who speak Russian in Ukraine. This newly elected government of Ukraine and all other Ukrainians are gonna steal property of these people in Crimea and eastern territories of Ukraine, and they are gonna rob these people and so on. But this is far from truth, opposite from the truth, and Russia intentionally openly lies to locals, to local population, because they want to divide Ukraine and steal Ukrainian soils from Ukraine. And no matter how wild it sounds, there are still people in Crimea and Ukraine who have no internet connection and who can watch only pro-Russian channels that spread gossips, misinformation, and distorted facts and lies about Ukraine and Ukrainians. And therefore, these people have no objective media channels to watch, independent media channels to watch, and therefore many of them buy into all these Russian lies, and this is horrible. And the only intention these pro-Russian forces have is to make people believe that the newly elected government is bad, evil, extremist, terroristic, and because the more people believe into all these lies, the more they will be scared of the newly elected government, and the more they will be scared of them, the more of them will want to vote in support of pro-Russian regime and give their vote against Ukraine, and the more they will want to become apart from Russia. And this is the genuine intention of this Russian information war against Ukraine. Next, Russians decided to organize a referendum where Crimean citizens will decide if they really want to be part of Ukraine or Russia. However, it's naive to think that the results of this referendum will be legitimate. How do you think, logically, how do you think will the results of this referendum be ever at all legitimate? Of course not. They will be fake. And there will be no observers, no watchers to prove that the results of this referendum are not fake. And simply logically, how do you think Russia has already spent fortune on Crimean campaign and war in Crimea? And it's absolutely clear that when Crimea is full of military forces and when press and observers aren't allowed to freely work, so it's absolutely clear that the results they will get from this referendum are gonna be fake 100%. Fake and only fake, and there will be no observers and watchers to prove that my words are wrong and that these results of this referendum are gonna be not fake. Because Russia wants to steal Crimea from Ukraine, and it's obvious to all the world. Plus, Russia has brought so many military forces into Crimea, and of course, they will. It's illogical that they won't allow any other result to happen. And the local population is afraid of these military forces, Russian military forces in Crimea. Russia will never allow any other result except that Crimean population wants to be part of Russia. But of course, that will never be legitimate, and the civilized world will never accept and admit that this referendum and the results of this referendum are legitimate. Russia understands that most people are in Europe and Asia are dependent on it. For example, they are dependent on its gas and so on. And Russia plus has nuclear weapon, and therefore Russia acts so aggressively as king of the world. So, as you understand, Russia hasn't only invaded Crimea, but Russia also started information war against Ukraine all over the world to make everyone believe that Russian people are good and Ukrainians are bad. However, most of the world is not naive, and it's clear that Russia lies to most of the civilized world. And if you think that some people on the east and in Crimea naturally hate each other and naturally want to be part of Russia, no, it's not true at all, because this is the result of Russian information war that artificially escalates the conflict and hatred between Ukraine. And again, presence of such a big presence of Russian military forces in Crimea really scares the local population of Crimea, and they don't want to have all these military Russian forces that pretend to protect them from Ukrainians. However, this is an open lie and far absolutely opposite from the truth. And if you don't believe me, simply check my information, verify it, use reputable sources of information, and don't blindly believe into all Russian information war, all this misinformation and distorted facts. Simply never blindly believe into anything, but use only reputable sources of information. And if you don't believe me, verify it. So these are just a few of the things that Russia is guilty of, and these are just some of the facts that Russia is guilty of, but there are many more. And again, Russia doesn't care about the concern of Europe and Asia, because Russia sees that there are no serious sanctions placed on Russia from these countries, European and Asian countries. And therefore, as you can see, Russia hasn't even slowed down, but Russia only increased its military presence in Crimea, and Russia openly acts like an aggressor, and Russia is not afraid of sanctions and reaction of the outer world. That's why if Europe and Asia close their eyes on Ukraine and allow to ruin Ukrainian sovereignty and destroy and don't place serious sanctions on Russia, if Europe and Asia don't place serious sanctions on Russia and therefore allow Russia to start this Ukraine-Russia war and happen this bloodshed, it won't be all. After that, Russia will steal eastern shores of Ukraine, after stealing Crimea, and after that the whole independence of Ukraine and the whole sovereignty of Ukraine will be in danger. But this is not all, and Russia will see that all Europe and Asia are afraid of placing sanctions on Russia, and therefore sovereignty of several other European countries located close to Russia will be also in danger. And this is not my exaggeration, because you've already seen that Russia behaves like king of the world and it doesn't care about the rest of the world. And I'm personally seriously worried about realistic threats of Russia, because Russia can start the Third World War, and this is not the first time Russia aggressively behaves without any excuses towards other countries. Remember the history war in Chechnya, in Georgia, Czech Republic, and so on. That's why Europe and Asia, if you allow this to happen, you will automatically allow Russia to act like this forever. Russia has already shown that it has no respect, and if you allow Russia to destroy Ukraine, you'll create a dinosaur that will eventually eat several other countries and will, or at least damage them. We live now in civilized world, and that's why please don't let this happen. Don't be afraid of placing sanctions onto Russia, because Russia is also dependent on you, and Russia won't be able to live independently without relations with other countries. That's why don't be afraid of placing sanctions onto Russia, because sooner or later Russian